But yeah, I think it's great.
All right, cool. So, Alex, thanks for coming on. You've done a number of interviews on near-death experiences on both sides of the issue, like with Michael Shermer, Stephen Novella, Susan Blackmore, and then what's it, Pim von, what is his name?
Pim von Lommel, Dr.
Pim von.
Pim.
Yes, I've seen quite a number of your interviews. They're very interesting, and you sent me a couple of links to research or to the research they've done, and I find it very interesting. I don't find any problems with it. Like, some of the skeptics have tried to argue against the research, but I don't. I'm not going to take that approach. I think the research is totally fine. I totally agree. Near-death experiences are a real thing, but my position is that it's not evidence of a non-physical mind because the brain just does weird things when it's in an impaired state. So could you tell me a little bit about why you see this as evidence of a non-physical mind?
Okay, first off, hats off to you. You've already proven me wrong to a certain extent and won the debate by showing up, man. I always say, skeptics never debate. And you not only initiated the debate, if you will, if we can call this a debate, but you engaged with the material, and I said, hey, I don't want to just have kind of a stupid ass, kind of debate. You're like, no, man, tell me what you had. And then what you said right there was, really cool. I think that you've engaged with it. So yeah, I'm super excited to join you and talk about that. And I think that the point that you just made is a really kind of important one, but I almost feel like we're, even with that, which is a great tee up to it, we're kind of jumping into the middle of this, because I think to really understand the debate, if you will, or the controversy, why people are so upset about this, we have to understand what's at stake for science, if you will, if consciousness does survive bodily death, as it appears to do in the near-death experience. So what do you think about that, kind of approach
Well,
from the beginning?
what do you mean exactly when you say what's at stake for science? Because I have no problem. If there's a life after death, that's awesome. If there's a supernatural, that's awesome. If we can prove there's magic, I would love all of that. And I don't see any conflict with science. I don't think there's anything at risk for science to admit that. Because if you can show it, science would love it. It would adopt it immediately. So I don't know what you mean when you say there's what's at risk at science by accepting this.
See, that's awesome that you said that, although I've heard that from skeptics for the longest time. And when I say skeptics, the skeptic thing is kind of tired. We're really talking about materialism. And I like in the intro email that you originally sent me, you said from a materialist atheist. And I'm hoping that we can talk about both of those, materialist and atheist. Because another thing, hats off to you again. I watched a couple of your videos, and I like the way you're careful about defining things, like defining atheist, and I'm sure we can go into defining materialist too, but not to skate past the point, because the point you just made there, I think, is really, really important. I think that there is a lot more at stake for science if consciousness survives death. First, we have to break down what is your understanding as a materialist of the definition of consciousness from a neuroscience standpoint. And so I'll just leave it at that.
So I would define consciousness as just an emergent property of the brain, kind of like how stars don't actually exist. They're just a whole bunch of hydrogen atoms that have come together and have been fused by gravity to have these new effects that weren't present with the individual hydrogen atoms. So I see consciousness as that same kind of a thing, where there's neurons in the brains and they're doing this new process that wasn't present with just the pure neurons, because they've come together and under new natural forces that cause it to have new interactions.
Awesome. So the emergent property of consciousness. I'm going to go out there on a limb and say right off the bat that that's a very shaky position. I think there's really only two intellectually honest positions regarding consciousness. But I would roll that back even further. And I hate to keep digressing, but I think this is the problem with these debates a lot of times. And I really like the way you're open to kind of approaching it here, but before I digress too far, the fundamental question that we're asking is, yeah, did you lose me?
No, I just muted my mic so you wouldn't hear me drinking.
Oh, okay. No, you come in really faint when you do that, so it's no problem. Um, are you talking to me or are you talking off camera?
I'm not saying anything right now. What?
Oh,
Oh,
that was
maybe
weird.
you're picking up my other mic that I have tried. I disabled it on my computer, but since we're using the website you sent me, maybe it's picking up both my mics, and so you could hear actually a backdrop.
Oh, I am. Is Zencaster coming in on a different mic?
I think it might be because because I have two mics that.
Actually, it sounds fine right now, Tom. So there's no problem. Um, I think when you mute it, it gets a little bit echoey.
All right.
So back to what we were talking about in terms of consciousness, and I kind of lost my train of thought a little bit.
So
But
I said consciousness was emergent, and you said that there's
right,
something wrong
thanks.
with that, and there's more fundamental.
Thank you. So, one of the four horsemen, if you will, of atheism is a guy named Daniel Dennett, right?
Right.
And Dan Dennett, he's a famous philosopher at Tufts University, and he's known for having the position for the longest time, and it is really essentially the position of science as we know it, that consciousness is an illusion. It's a trick. It's not real. There's this physical property to your brain, these neurons firing, chemicals, all that stuff, and it creates consciousness. Now, what you're saying is really something a little bit different, which is the middle ground that people have gone to. Because a lot of people attacked Dennett and said that's kind of an absurd idea that consciousness is an illusion, that our entire experience of who we are isn't real. That's a theory that isn't supported by anyone's experience. So it's just kind of a standalone idea out there. And then you had these other people on the other side who, and this traces all the way back to the great mystical physicists. So Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrodinger and the cat, and even Einstein at the end of his life were saying, hey, there's something going on here with this thing that we call consciousness that seems to be coming into play, and we have to deal with it. And the most extreme part of that position is the idea of idealism, which is a fancy term, but it just means that somehow or another, consciousness is at the core of everything that we see and experience. So what you're saying with this emergent property is this kind of murky middle ground that people in the mainstream science community have, and it's really part of the mainstream science community, have kind of glopped on to try and fix the problem of Daniel Dennett, consciousness is an illusion, which is a goofy idea. And you can even hear Sam Harris and David Chalmers, Sam Harris, well-known atheist, and David Chalmers, one of the best-known consciousness researchers. I always play this clip where they're going, Dennett doesn't really believe that, does he? Because it's kind of a goofy idea. So it's really a passé idea that consciousness is an illusion. And what people have adopted is this consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. So I'd ask anyone who wants to take that position from a scientific standpoint, I'd say, okay, then tell me about consciousness. When does it begin? When does it end? What's necessary and sufficient to cause consciousness? Where does consciousness exist? We think we're conscious. Are dogs conscious? Most people say, yeah. Are rocks conscious? Most people say no. The fact is, we don't know. We don't have an answer to any of those questions. So unlike a lot of scientific debates that we would have, where we would both be piling up data and trying to figure out whose data is better, in this case, what we have is just, I think this is, everyone would agree, just two theories about what is the nature of this consciousness. Because to say consciousness is an emergent property of the brain doesn't really mean anything. It's just a theory. There's nothing to support that. Just like if I was going to say, and so in a minute, we'll talk about consciousness surviving death, and why that's a way to kind of, in a roundabout way, approach this question of, is consciousness an emergent property of the brain? But let me back up. Do you get everything I'm saying, or do you have a problem with any of that?
Well, a couple things. First, your note on Dan Dennett. I don't take Dan Dennett's approach. I see what Dan Dennett does is when he refutes consciousness is kind of like what he does when he accepts free will. He's changing the definition a bit. So trying to understand what he really believes is a tough process because we aren't actually.
Because he's a philosopher.
Right. Right. So I definitely don't take Dan Dennett's approach. And I think most people agree consciousness exists as something. We just don't know what it is. And you're right that saying consciousness is an emergent property is essentially just saying consciousness is some unknown natural phenomenon. It's just like saying that consciousness is a supernatural phenomenon. We don't know what it is. We have no idea.
So we are in agreement there that those are on par. To say that consciousness is a natural phenomenon is on par with saying that consciousness is a supernatural. And I don't like the term supernatural, but you used it, so we'll just say it. There is no grounding that we can say consciousness is a physical property. Consciousness fits into materialism for all these reasons that I said, because I can press you and say, when does it begin? When does it end? What's necessary and sufficient? And you would say, hey, these are normally things I can tell you in science. I can tell you all those things, and then I can say something's real. And with regard to consciousness, you can't say any of those things. So you have to say, hey, my best guess is that consciousness is this natural property of the brain, right?
Right. So we can't explain consciousness at all. We don't know what it is. So when we try to answer those questions, we don't have answers to those. But I would say that the naturalist explanation is a little better than the supernatural.
You would say that, and I wouldn't say that. But here's the point.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. So just to clarify, because we have induction, we know that the naturalistic things have worked in the past. We have lots of reason to believe there are these naturalistic things that exist in the world and they can produce stuff, whereas we don't have, as far as the naturalist worldview, you don't have any evidence of the supernatural actually being there. So it's kind of like just making up a new category and then saying, well, consciousness could be this new category of thing that we have no evidence for. So that would not have any basis.
I don't agree with any of that. I agree with the first part of what you said, and everything beyond that is some form of kind of fudging with things. So I like where we were. We're in agreement that to say that consciousness is a known physical phenomenon, we can't say that. To say that consciousness is, so we're in agreement with that. All the rest of that stuff, we'd get sidetracked in all this kind of bullshit arguments that people have about, all these definitions of what, it's a red herring and all those things. I don't want to get into that shit. Here's where I would propel the conversation is back to your first question about near-death experience. Because, Tom, I can tell you, and I told you in the email that I sent to you, I don't have any real interest in near-death experience. I started this thing just trying to answer big picture questions. And the biggest picture question, who am I? And that's both a philosophical question, but it's also the fundamental scientific question. And it's also happens to be the fundamental spiritual question. So it's a good, big fucking question. And here's the thing about who are we as it relates to consciousness. You can go try and answer that question like I did, and you can go look at parapsychology. You can go look at neuroscience and neuroplasticity, and you can go look at all these ways to potentially falsify this emergent property of the brain thing. But the cleanest and easiest way to do it, I found, or I think, in my opinion, is to look at this near-death experience science. Because if consciousness exists beyond bodily death, then all bets are off and you gotta kind of come over to my camp. So that can be that's the reason I got interested in it is, number one, here's some real science. At this point, over 200 peer-reviewed, published papers on near-death experience science. There's some real data we can glom onto. And at the end of the day, if it is what it seems to be, then we have a whole new ball game with regard to this question that we both think is a fundamental question about the nature of consciousness. What do you think about that? Are you on board with that?
Yeah, if we can show that you can have consciousness independent of the brain, that's good evidence that consciousness can exist in a non-material kind of a way. From my experience, I'm happy to grant all of the research that I've looked at. It seems like pretty decent research as far as I can tell, but the only thing I would disagree with would be the conclusion, like this doesn't indicate that there's anything outside of the brain. Like all of this can be explained with just brain stuff.
Right. So hey, we've crossed the biggest mountain, I think, to be able to define things in those ways and to understand that that is the interest that is really underlying the interest in near-death experience. And that's why near-death experience science creates so much havoc, and we'll talk about that maybe or maybe not, but it's why people who study near-death experience take a lot of heat. It's why people like Eben Alexander, who come out, and even though he's a Harvard brain surgeon, he's more or less attacked. And the reason behind that is there is a lot at stake with this near-death experience science. But TJump, you don't care about any of that. You were cool with that. You just said, show me, prove me that it's real, and I respect that.
Yeah, just one caveat there. I'd say the reason they're being attacked isn't exactly how you're describing it. The reason I think they're being attacked is because the ideology of idealism and dualism have been shown to be essentially empty. Like they're just labels that we put on things. They don't really have any value. And so if you're trying to impose these to try and explain things until we actually have some kind of mechanistic way to interact with this other ontology of stuff, it's kind of just an empty label. Like if I said unknown natural phenomenon kind of a thing. Like we can just label it, but then we can do nothing with it. And so using it as an explanation isn't an explanation. And that's why they're attacked for trying to use these as explanations of the near-death experience.
Fair enough. That's not the way that I see it, obviously, but we're going to avoid those kind of silly arguments because what you said is could be perfectly valid. There's no way I can say it's one way or another. So I'll just leave that stand. And so now let's talk about near-death experience science. And one of the things that I think we're going to get into right off the bat, and you've kind of teed it up already, is this idea of death. And one of the things you'll hear from critics of near-death experience science is to say, well, they're not really dead. And I know they're not really dead because they came back and they weren't really dead. Do you have any standing position on that?
I would not approach it in that way exactly, I don't think.
Okay. Because that's a common argument, and if you're not the research on that or the science on that is really the other way around. Is the misnomer is that it's not near-death experience, it's death experience. And where we would go to confirm that is with scientists, doctors in this case, who deal with death. And one of the top ones in the world is a guy named Dr. Sam Parnia. And he's at New York Stony Brook. He was at Cornell before that when he published a lot of this research on near-death experience science. And he's one of the top resuscitation doctors, researchers in the world. So he's looking at what brain death means. When do we die? When can those cells be restored and get to working again? And what he'll tell you is that, number one, these people are dead. We can't say all of it because first of all, there's a broad category of people that fall into this category of near death. But the ones that we usually talk about are people that have had a cardiac arrest, that is, they've had a heart attack, their heart has stopped, and they're 3 to 5, 7, sometimes even longer minutes past that heart stopping. Because that's at a point when Sam Parnia would say, these people are dead by every way that we talk about death medically and measure it. So these people are truly dead. So the next question that kind of the back door for people is, okay, they're dead, but what do we know about their brain? Their brain really isn't dead. I heard about this research at University of Michigan where these rats had a little spike in their brain, 15 minutes after they died. Again, that's bullshit. And the reason it's bullshit is because what we know from 70 plus years of solid neuroscience is we know what it takes for a brain to create complex consciousness, like the kind of consciousness it's required to have this kind of conversation, let alone the kind of consciousness that would be required to have the most extraordinary experience of your life. It would require an enormous amount of brain activity and an enormous amount of stuff that would light up any EEG. and we don't see that. What neuroscience tells us is that within 10 to 15 seconds after that heart stops, there is no electrical activity in the brain. And therefore, we cannot assume, unless you're going to, and sometimes people, unless you want to kind of overthrow neuroscience as we know it and say, oh no, there's this other kind of brain activity that doesn't show up in any way, but it somehow creates. So that's just kind of a silliness that I don't think we have to get into.
Well, actually, I'd kind of like to pick up on that silliness a little bit. So,
okay.
I agree with you that there is no measurable brain activity based on our current understandings and methods. But to quote Thomas Edison, he said, we only know 1/1000% of anything. So saying that we can't measure it with our current activity, therefore there is no brain activity, is like saying, well, we've discovered a hammer and a screwdriver, and it can't be done with a hammer and a screwdriver, therefore it can't be done with any tools, and it must be magic.
Well, so, Tom, that doesn't... I'm sorry, go ahead.
So there is still brain activity. So the way I define brain activity is the cell still working? Is it alive? Is it still processing energy? Does it still have ATP? Is it still sending signals? If that is happening, if there's a single cell in the brain doing that, that's brain activity by my definition. And we can't measure that. With the fMRIs measure like a minimum of like tens to hundreds of thousands of clusters of cells, and if those are firing at a significant rate. So we can't measure that kind of level. There's 100 billion neurons in the brain, 100 trillion connections. We cannot measure that detail to know when all of the cells in the brain are dead. So there can still be brain activity if we define it as just the cells working and not all dead. In that would not qualify as the kind of brain activity that we can measure in an EEG or whatever.
Right, but see, here is kind of where you're jumping off of science. So if we're going to stick to the science, then like I say, when you're talking about brain death, brain activity, you're going to start with Sam Parnia, who's just a recognized world expert in resuscitation, not just near-death experience. And you'd ask him. And then you'd go ask people like the guy I interviewed who's an expert on EEG, and you'd go ask him, you know, is it possible what you're saying is true? Is it possible that we're having all this, that there is this consciousness that isn't being measured by our current thing?
I apologize. Let me clarify. So I agree there isn't consciousness. You do need that EEG level to have consciousness. I agree with you on that part.
But so then it's game over.
What?
But then it's game over, right? Unless we get into the time thing.
No. So here's my explanation of NDEs. When you are awake, conscious experience, 99% of everything you experience is your subconscious. This is not your conscious mind that you're experiencing. You don't experience colors. Colors are an imposition onto things that your subconscious mind puts there. All your emotional associations, your distance tracking, all of that stuff is your subconscious mind. So if we lose consciousness, that doesn't mean we lose subconsciousness. So we can lose the conscious mind activity, but still have our subconscious working as it does, still causing all of our bodily functions and neurons to fire and electrical signals throughout our body without consciousness. You don't need consciousness for any of that. So the subconscious mind can still be processing all of our sensations, taste, touch, sight, smell, and putting that into its the model of reality that our conscious mind experiences. But without consciousness, we just don't experience it. So it's still being put to the brain, but we don't have this conscious experience of it, and it's being saved to our memory as if it was conscious experience. So like if you imagine you're just walking around every day normally, and you suddenly lose conscious experience without any prior warning, then your subconscious is still going to be doing what it normally does, and it's still going to be saving all of that information as conscious memory. So my explanation is that when people go through these near-death experiences, it's their subconscious putting all of this stuff in as conscious experience into memory. So they're not actually experiencing it. They just remember it as having experienced it. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It just isn't supported by science. I mean, any neuroscientist will tell you that that's not how our measurement of brain activity works. You would have to be defining some kind of new kind of brain activity, like you were saying before, that has yet been undiscovered. And as you know, that's just really, if we're going to speculate that far, then I can suggest all sorts of angels and demons and other things that have to come into play. You know, if we're going to play in this little playground called established science, and in this case it'd be established neuroscience, then I think we have to play within those parameters, and those parameters wouldn't allow what you're saying, no one would support that idea. And a lot of people have tried, right? Because this near-death experience science, and we can talk about this, but I don't want to get us sidetracked.
Oh no, I totally
Plenty,
agree.
plenty of people have tried to. Plenty of people have tried to explain what's going on. That explanation isn't really on the table.
Right, I agree with you, but I'm saying neither is yours. The brain not being a physical thing also isn't supported by science and also isn't on the table. So right now we're on equal footing, except mine hasn't implicit.
Because here's the problem, is that you're standing and you're defending a particular position. It is the neuroscience position. It's like you said at the beginning, consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. My position is a falsification of your position. And it says, if I can show consciousness at a time when we can more or less agree that the brain is so severely compromised that it shouldn't be able to create conscious experiences, memories, let alone the most significant experiences of someone's life, then I have falsified your position, because it can no longer stand up that we didn't have that brain that you said it was emerging from, and we still had consciousness. So I will have falsified your position.
Well, no, you've only falsified that our current science can't explain consciousness at that level. So it's like, it goes back to my analogy. If all we've discovered is a screwdriver and a hammer, and it can't be done with a screwdriver and a hammer, well, then it therefore must be magic and can't be done with any tools.
But that's what you're saying. Tom, that's what you're saying.
No, remember, your position is to falsify my position. And my position is consciousness is an emergent property of natural processes, which means you can't just falsify the known natural processes. You have to falsify all natural processes, including the ones we don't know. So all I have to do is show, here's a potential natural process that can explain it. If you can't falsify that, then you haven't falsified naturalism.
That's not how, like I said, that's kind of not how it works in terms of science, right? What you're suggesting would require a whole new kind of neuroscience that is completely beyond what we currently understand. So we can have that, that's called like a promissory note, and you can have that promissory note. Well, I can have all sorts of promissory notes, like I said, about angels and demons and about all the rest of that stuff. But that's kind of bullshitty. You know what I mean?
Right.
You gotta stick to what's known. You can't say, oh, it's out there, we just haven't discovered it yet. Like I said, talk to the experts and they'll tell you, no, there's no, and the way to ask the question is really interesting, because I've done it in the interviews. Take it outside of near-death experience. This gets into your atheism shit with like apologetics with Christians, like you can get Christians to agree to a lot of fucking stuff that is stupid, but then when you put it back in the context of what they want to believe, they go, oh, no, here's how it fits in backwards. Well, the same thing here. Go talk to, like I did, an expert on EEGs, and don't say shit about near-death experience. Just say, hey, is there any chance that a brain could be like this and show this kind of electrical activity, and yet there's consciousness going on? And what they'll tell you is, no way. We have not only 50, 70 years of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of established research on humans as well as on animals. We know that shit backwards and forwards. There's nothing there. So when you go talk to them independently, you get a straight answer. So then you can't do the apologetics thing, go, oh, yeah, but even though he's been studying it for 20 years, and even though there's thousands of papers, there's something those guys have missed that'll explain this near-death experience after all.
Well, I think you've kind of misunderstood how science works. You're confusing epistemology and ontology. So to go back to my Thomas Edison point, Thomas Edison, he said, we only know 1/1,000,000th of 1% of anything, and that applies to neurology. We don't have it down. There is a lot of stuff we don't. Anyone who says otherwise is wrong, immediately wrong. There's neurology and biology are the two most complicated fields in science and the ones we know the least about. If you think we know, if we really understand this, then you're just deluded. We don't at all.
I was interviewing this guy one time, and we were talking about ancient aliens and stuff like that. And the guy was a Christian, so he was really debunking the alien thing. And I was really open to his data, but then I kind of had to push him on the Christian thing, and he goes, and he was a literal, biblical literalist, and he goes, they found nails. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, well, archaeologically, they found that they smelted the metal, that they had the nails. His point was, hey, Noah really could have built that ark because there were nails. And that always stuck with me, because it's like, it's not about the fucking nails, dude. It's about the story doesn't make any sense. You can't get hundreds of species of bees on a fucking, just the whole thing is just fucking wacky. And that's what you're offering up here. It's just wacky to say, well, yeah, of course, that's how neuroscience works. But you know what? Thomas Edison said there's 1% and there's something else out there. And Alex, it'll be discovered in the future. We'll find that even when brains show no activity, there really is some super duper background consciousness that's no one ever known about until now. And it'll be discovered in the future. Fucking hey, Tom, if that's what you think, man, maybe, there's no reason to debate that. I can't debate your belief, your faith that somehow there's something out there that will rescue you from the hard facts of what we know right now. I can't debate that.
Well, I'm not sure you're understanding how science works here. So there's lots of things.
No. I got it. I got how science works.
Let's go with like an example of the quantum physics. Quantum physics, we discovered this particle duality, where the double slit experiment, we couldn't explain it, and nothing in the current physics could explain it. Nothing. So then do we just say, well, it must not be physics, we'll just attribute it to supernatural? Well, no, we just keep doing physics, and eventually we do discover it. That's kind of how science works. There's lots of things we can't explain, but there's always more to discover. So I'm not sure how your analogy compares here, because mine is just, this is how science works. There's lots of things we don't know. We then learn more, and there's always more we can learn. Like, everything in science is tentative. Like, as Thomas Edison said, we only know 1/1,000,000% of anything. We have not completed any study in any field ever. We're not even close. So the fact that we couldn't just discover more is like, the fact that this is strange to you is very odd. I don't quite understand why you think that's comparable to the nails in the cross.
It wasn't the nails in the cross, it was nails in Noah's Ark.
Nails in, my apologies.
This is where, these debates just go downhill, because
I think this is the weakness of your position. I think you've misunderstood how science works completely, and which is why so many people criticize your position. Like, this is just a fact of science. We know nothing. Essentially, of the universe, we know nothing. We know zero of everything.
So let me make sure I understand your position. Your position is, yes, near-death experiences happen. They happen after a time which the brain appears to be severely compromised, and in the way that we normally associate with a brain that produces consciousness. But there is some other processes going on that we can't currently measure that would account for the near-death experience. Is that a fair summary of your position?
Yeah, I can actually go into more detail too. Like, we know we can't measure that level of detail, because we know these things only measure at a certain level, which is a range of tens to hundreds of thousands of neurons.
Okay, but hold on, before you go into all that, because you're not an expert in any of that. What about the experts in neuroscience who say, well, Tom, we've already tried to measure that. We don't believe that there is any activity at this point. There is any explanation for what you're talking about. When brains are in these compromised states and they're not producing any electrical activity. Tom, we've studied this every which way for 70 years. There's no evidence of those kind of brain states ever producing consciousness. What would you say to those neuroscientists?
Well, I'd say you're misrepresenting them, because anyone I talk to, I'm going to ask, can you measure at this level? They're going to say, no, our technology only goes to this level. We can't measure at this level yet.
Well, when they come back and say, but Tom, we've measured it at this level and we don't see anything.
Right, and I'm going to say, can you measure it at this level? They're going to say, no, the maximum resolution we have is this level. We can't measure it. We do not have the physical capabilities with fMRIs or EEGs to measure at this level yet. We cannot.
You believe that at some point down the future, we'll get to that level, and then magically the problem will be solved, and we'll say, oh, there it is, that's what happened.
Well, my argument is that you're trying to falsify this position, that at any level, that there can be a physical explanation of consciousness. No, I'm saying you can't make that claim. You can't justify that claim. You can only claim that to this level of magnitude, we don't have a physical explanation of consciousness. 100% agree with you. But you can't claim at this level there isn't one.
Hey, maybe Noah built that fucking ark, man. I don't know if he built the ark. It just doesn't seem very likely to me. But hey, maybe.
Well,
maybe
this is comparable to the ark example. I mean, because this is just science.
But you don't have any science, dude. Tom, you're just saying at some point there will be some discovery that will rescue my position. You're not basing it on anything that's been published so far. The closest thing you have is are you familiar with the study from the University of Michigan with the brain burst after 15 minutes of no brain activity in the rats?
No, I'm not. I haven't even looked.
Let me give it to you really, really simply, because this is like the closest thing that we have to science to support your position.
Well, actually, I just saw one about where they tried to revitalize a pig's brains after it was killed, and they tried to reignite the brain activity, and they got some of it to work. That was pretty cool.
Well, listen to this one, because it is the closest one I know that would fit into your wacky theory, and that's that these guys at the University of Michigan, they studied rats, and they looked at the EEG of these rats, and the rats died, and then there was a period of time, and it was in the minutes range, like 5, 10, I want to say 15 minutes, and there was no activity, and then at the very end, there was this burst of activity. And they didn't say it had anything to do with near-death experience, but a bunch of people jumped on the cause and said, because people like you are looking for some way to kind of blast out the near-death experience science. And they said, hey, that's it. That's near-death experience. That's what it must be. See, we thought, what you're saying, we thought these brains were dead, and yet here they are. We're having this burst of activity at the end. That's the closest thing you have to science. Again, that's a wacky idea and isn't supported by the near-death experience science if you really look at it and if you really talk to the experts. But it's closer to what you're talking about than to just say, well, there's something else out there that we haven't discovered yet that'll solve the problem.
Let me clarify. I think I'm making a different argument here. So your position is trying to falsify the naturalist position, right? Is that correct?
Well, what we said was that we both agreed that if you take the position that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, one area of science to look at where we could kind of get a handle on whether that's true or not is near-death experience, because near-death experience claims to be about people who are having consciousness experiences at a time when the brain is so severely compromised that modern-day neuroscience would say it's impossible for it to have conscious experiences. So
right there, you just made a critical mistake. Modern science can't ever say anything is impossible. Science is always.
I didn't actually say impossible. I said modern science would say it's not within. Maybe I did say impossible. I'm sorry, but it's saying that modern science, neuroscience, would say there's no brain activity when there's no electrical activity in the brain. That's what modern neuroscience would say, categorically. So you can go in.
Again, the categorically is the same thing as impossible. All science is tentative and provisional.
Okay, dude.
Science can say is we can't measure this. That's it. It can't say it doesn't exist. It says we can't say there is no supernatural. We can just say we can't measure any supernatural.
Right. Yeah, there's no argument there. It's just
okay, so here's my argument. You can't claim that it's not a natural explanation because it could be one we just haven't discovered yet. So you can't then conclude that because we can't measure it, there is not a natural explanation. Now, there may or may not be. I'm not going to make a claim on that. I'm just saying that you do not have the justification to conclude it is not a natural explanation, and therefore it's supernatural.
Just like you can't claim that Noah didn't build that ark because there are evidence of nails. You cannot prove that he didn't build that ark. You can't prove that.
Right, I can't prove he didn't build the ark. I can just say it's incredibly unlikely. But there's no
I'm saying that it's incredibly unlikely that after 70 years of neuroscience and EEG science and thousands of peer-reviewed papers in both humans and animals, that it's highly unlikely that they just, oh gosh darn, they missed something. And there's this whole other area of consciousness that if they just had a little bit better measurement of it, they would have it. Highly unlikely.
That's like a guaranteed 100% that there's lots of stuff about the brain we don't know. I mean, would you disagree with that statement that there's lots of stuff about the brain we don't know?
All we can do is argue inside of the parameters of what's known and what's science. This, I don't even like engaging in this because this is, you know what, you've done a fantastic job with this thus far. I just don't like getting into all the skeptical bullshit of, you know, falsification. This it's all just nonsense. You just look at the science, you talk to the best experts. If you have a better expert, I sent you all those papers. I've interviewed.
No, I agree with all of that. I agree with all of the science.
No, you don't agree with all of it, because if you agreed with all of it, this is a really interesting point that I'll make, unless I'm interrupting you and you had something.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead. I do want to pick up on that, but go ahead.
So the way we would normally, in my opinion, the way we would normally handle this is we would go to the researchers who've really studied it. And we'd look at those researchers, like Dr. Penn von Lommel that you mentioned, Dr. Jeff Long, Dr. Sam Parnia, Dr. Penny. Well, he didn't really research near-death experience. He just had one. And then he researched it a little bit afterwards. But all these other people, what's interesting about them, Tom, is they just were curious. They were doctors. You talk to Jeff Long, he's a great guy. I've talked to him many times. He's just doing his thing. He's a radiation oncologist. But when he was, doing his residency, he stumbled across these people that seemed to come back from the dead and report these things. He's like looking around like, hey, did everyone else see this? What's going on? And he couldn't believe that everyone else was like, hey, man, don't go there. Just kind of do your thing. Well, he did his thing, but he also went there. The same with Penn von Lommel. He's a world-recognized cardiologist in the Netherlands. And he just stumbles across this and he says, I'm not going to let this go. So these guys don't have an agenda. They're not on the board of the Christian church of whatever trying to advance something. They're just curious doctors wondering what their patients are experiencing. So normally what we do is just rely heavily on their conclusions. And the most hard-ass one of them was Sam Parnia. I interviewed him on this show several times. I interviewed him a few years ago, and I said, what's your conclusion about all this? And he goes, if I had to conclude at this point, I'd say that this is a trick of the mind. And I really held his feet to the fire. I really I held his feet to the fire. A trick of the mind. And he goes, well, I don't know, but he kind of held to that position. And then a few years later, he did more research and he said, I was undecided before. Now I'm decided. I'm with everyone else. It appears by every way that we understand it, consciousness seems to survive bodily death. So that's what every near-death experiencer down the line, looking at it in every possible way, looking at blood samples, if there's any blood change, if they're looking at chemicals in the brain, looking at brain activity, looking at the whole shebang, they all come to the same conclusion. Consciousness survives bodily death. So, Tom, you can jump in there and say maybe they missed something, but I think it behooves you to kind of bring something to the table with evidence. One more point. I know you've let me go on for a long time. Michael Shermer, who is, like I said in my multiple interviews with me, is my favorite frenemy. I like the guy. I always have a good time when I talk to him. It's fun. But his position is wacky. It's worse than wacky. What he's done is misrepresented, and this is clear to anyone. He's misrepresented the position of the near-death experience researchers. So he's taken Penn von Lommel and said, oh no, Penn von Lommel said the opposite. And it pissed off Penn von Lommel so much that he had to write a paper and had to write a response and go, damn it, Shermer, in Scientific American, you wrote that I said this. No, I said the opposite. So that is the current state. So if you're going to counter that, I just think it behooves you to bring some science to the table, not just your opinion about Edison and it might be discovered down. I mean, that these guys have looked at it, dude. It's not like this hasn't been explored.
Right. So I'm not going to try and defend Michael Shermer. No. So here's the position. Science. I agree with all. I'm not going to argue that any of those people are biased or that they're trying to manipulate the research or that any of their research is wrong. I'm happy to grant all of their research. The part I'm rejecting is their conclusion, which is why they're criticized so heavily, is because everyone is rejecting their conclusion. And the reason is because their conclusion goes beyond the evidence. their conclusion, like as you admitted earlier, is unsupported. Like they're on equal terms. The naturalist explanation and the supernaturalist explanation neither have science to support them. So all of the science indicates right now is that at a certain level we can measure brain activity. At that level, we cannot measure brain activity occurring in these states, and there is still stuff happening. Now, that doesn't indicate it's natural. That doesn't indicate it's supernatural. That just means we don't know what's going on. Full stop. That's where the science ends. And going beyond that in either direction is unsupported. Whether you want to say it's a supernatural thing or a natural thing, either one is unsupported. And so my position is that their conclusions are equally unsupported as me saying, well, it's just a natural process like this thing I described earlier. We don't know. And so coming to that conclusion is unsupported, which is why they're criticized.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. I think it's been a fair discussion. At this point, I'm at the frustration point with that I get with skeptics, and you're way above, way on the top of the heap in terms of the skeptics I've talked to. So I commend you for everything you're doing. The part I did is, to jump off then and say, kind of like they missed it. It's like, man, go talk to these guys. These guys are super sharp. They don't miss the obvious shit like that. They don't miss stuff. They've looked for it every which way. But you're entitled to your opinion, and you're certainly familiar. You've dug into the data. I commend you for that. And we just have a difference at that point that is kind of, we can't really resolve. I think we're.
Well, could you set up an interview where I can ask them these questions? Because I'm pretty sure I can get them to admit the same thing. I'd be happy to talk with any of them.
Oh, yeah, I don't even have to set it up. I'm happy to. You tell me who you want to. I'm happy to help you.
Well, you tell me whoever would be the best in this. You tell me.
You tell me. You tell me whoever you want to talk to. You can go through. I have all my shows are on there. Pick pick a show that you say, bam, you think that guy is somebody I'd like to talk to, and I'll do it. You got to be kind of careful how you approach them, because a lot of them are pretty reluctant to talk to skeptics because of this thing. It's like,
right,
you can't go talk to Pin von Lommel, who is a world-class cardiologist who's published all this shit, and say, yeah, dude, but your conclusion is whack. It's not. I mean, it just doesn't fly. It's not how it works. He didn't miss anything. He's been to all the conferences. His conclusion, the only thing you can say is like Shermer did. Shermer took on Pin von Lommel, and he just misrepresented what he said. The same thing with Patricia Churchland. You can go listen to my interview with her. Shermer was the first one to do it. Shermer took Pin von Lommel's thing, and he said what you said. He said, yeah, but his conclusion is it's really what Michael Shermer said is, here's Pin von Lommel's near-death experience research. And if you really look at it the way that I'm looking at it, it supports my position that it's a physical process, it's materialism.
That would be a mistake. I wouldn't do that. So
but hold on. That's what Shermer did.
Right.
That's what Patricia Churchland did. That's what the researcher, I forget her name right now, who published another peer-reviewed paper did. They all took Pin von Lommel, and they copied it, and they copied it, and copied it. And I went and interviewed all of them, and they're all full of shit. And Patricia Churchland was a babbling idiot, because I said, I was nice, but I said, here's what you said, and here's what Pin von Lommel said. So it just doesn't really, it doesn't make sense for you to sit there and say, I want to talk to Pin von Lommel and tell him his conclusion from the data isn't correct because I'm going to point out some kind of no one can possibly know everything kind of thing. I mean, that's going to be an embarrassing situation for you, and he wouldn't agree to it. But you can send him an email. He gets those emails all the time, and he'll respond, or send it to me, and I'll send it to him and ask him to respond. But you get the point. I mean, that's a flat Earth kind of thing. I mean, you can't go to get to people in a geologist and talk about flat Earth. I mean, they're just like, dude, I'm not wasting my time about it. So for you to go and say, you missed something, there's something else out there, we just haven't discovered it yet, they're not going to take that seriously.
Well, it's really interesting because of the problem of underdetermination, which is in science means that you always do that. That's just a fact. You always miss something. It's not possible
You
for you
know who
not
you
to
should
miss something.
talk. You know who you should talk to then, Tom. You should talk to people, and like I said, here would be my suggestion: is talk to people, not the near-death experience science people. Talk to the neuroscience people, and take NDE, the near-death experience, out of it.
Right.
Talk to like the guy I talked to on in the EEG thing, and say, hey, is it possible that, I know you've studied EEG, and I know you said, is it possible that there's something else out there? Because that's your position that we haven't discovered. And
Right, that's what I was asking for. I was asking for you to, like, could you set something up for exactly that? I want to talk about, just get rid of the near-death experience. Just talk.
it's been it's been years since I talked to that guy. You can try and talk to him again. He's easy to find on my website. If you don't find him, email me. I'll email you who he is. But you can find a dozen other people, and then you know how it is. You do these shows. You just have to track them down and see if they'll talk to you. But if you take the NDE out of it and just ask it and say, say, is it possible that there's some order of that, then do it, and don't do it with the near-death experience. Just do it with the neuroscience guys.
I've done that. I've gotten the answers. I know that there's a ton about the brain we don't know. And every single one of them I've talked to has admitted this 100% of the time. This is why I'm asking for you.
Who have you talked to? Who have you talked to?
I go to the University of Minnesota and talk to neurologists and biologists all the time. I work with one who's doing research on rat brains and certain kinds of things. I do this all the time. So tell me, who would you be convinced by if I could talk to and they would?
I'll be happy then. Get your neuroscience guy from Minnesota.
No,
and we'll talk to him.
To pick somebody. This is, who would you be convinced by? Tell me who you want me to talk to.
It's your position. Like I'm telling you, man.
I know.
We'll talk to him. We'll talk to him together. Tom, to get someone to say, is it possible that there's something that we don't know about the brain? I mean, shit. Yes, anyone's going to say that.
Right.
But why are you so happy about that? What I'm saying is that's just not a logical way to do it. That's like the flat Earth guys going, is it possible? Is it possible that everyone has missed something? And like you said when we had this thing about the Noah's Ark thing, and you said, that's possible, it's just highly unlikely. Well, that's what they're going to tell you about the idea that there's something that everyone for 70 years has missed, and that even when these brains are flat, there's still all this consciousness that's going on. They're going to go, Tom, maybe, dude, because we can't say we can't say anything's impossible, but that is highly, highly, highly unlikely from everything that we've seen so far. So that's the point. We're going over the same thing again and again.
Right.
I'm happy to talk to any of those people.
Well,
What's that?
I can prove you wrong on that. Just give me an opportunity. Tell me who you want me to talk to, and I will prove you wrong in 5 minutes on this.
I will agree to jointly talk with anyone that you want to talk, anyone that you bring on. I'm not going to go trace that down for the reasons that I just told you. It's kind of an absurd idea, to get someone to admit that we don't know everything about the brain. Hey, we don't know everything about the brain. My point is,
if you don't know everything about the brain, then why are you jumping to the conclusion it's not the brain?
Damn it. I'm saying the same. This is the part that we just got to end this. I'm telling you, I talked to a guy. You can find him on my website, world-renowned expert in EEG, and he says, is there any chance that there's anything going on that isn't being measured by EEG? He says, no, it's just would be highly, highly unlikely, because we have all this research that we've done for 70 years with thousands of papers with animals and humans. It's just highly unlikely that there's something that is out there that hasn't happened yet. So might it happen in the future? Like all that's sure, but that's not where these people are at. It would just be an incredibly embarrassing conversation to say, yeah, I know that, but is it possible? Is it possible that there's something more? He's like, dude, I study EEG science all the time. There's never anything in the literature like what you're saying. Is it possible? Is it possible that it's out there? Yeah, maybe it's possible, but it's just, that's not where these guys, they haven't found it. They haven't seen it.
Well, you're contradicting yourself. I mean, I can prove this in 5 seconds. Yes, there are things in the brain we can't measure.
Okay.
Our machines only measure to a certain degree of accuracy. They don't measure smaller. So I can prove that it's a fact in science. You're just wrong.
You're right about all those things. We don't know everything. So
Right, and that's just my conclusion. We don't know everything. We have a limited amount of information. It doesn't indicate your conclusion, just like it doesn't indicate a different other conclusion that doesn't have any evidence. They're both unsupported. We can't jump beyond the evidence to a conclusion that isn't supported by the evidence.
TJump can't jump beyond the evidence. That'd be a good tagline. All right, I do appreciate your approach, and I appreciate the debate. It was good.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you take the time to have a conversation.
Absolutely. I mean everything I say. I respect your ability to dig into the data, and we don't have to agree. These conversations are important. So very cool.
Yeah, I said, if you could just give me a name, I'll reach out to Penn Van Lommel and the other people, because I'd like to have this conversation if they're willing. And I've had conversations with young Earth creationists and other people, so I think I'm polite enough that they may be willing to have the conversation. So I'd love to try and reach out to them and see if they'd be willing to. So,
I will support you in that, in terms of you send an email, tell me who you want to talk to. I'll try and hook you up. But you can't do what I just said. That is an embarrassing situation, and I wouldn't set that up. I wouldn't set up a situation where you're going to get someone to say, but would you agree that we don't know everything? Would you agree that there might be something in the future that will disprove that? That's flat Earth shit. It's just flat Earth shit, man. I'm not going to create that kind of situation. It's not professional. It's not scientific. You could say that about anything, and I don't want to go there. So if you have specifics, I'm happy to connect you. Otherwise, if you want to connect with somebody on your own, I'm happy to be part of that. But those are the only parameters I put on that.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, you just keep what you call
no, it's just the way it is. You can do it on your own. There's nothing stopping you.
No, I'm not agreeing. I'm told you're right on that. I plan to do it on my own. But the part I'm disagreeing with is when you say that's unscientific. What you're saying is unscientific.
It's flat earthy. It's flat earthy. Go talk to the flat Earth guys. Go talk to the flat Earth people. They're all over science, right? Go talk to the flat Earth people. They will talk to you about science all day long. So. Right. Yeah, so that's you're in flat Earth territory with this. We've talked about it a million times, man. It's great.
I just want to clarify that one point: is what you keep saying is flat earthy is the definition of science. You're saying the definition of science is flat earthy, because what I'm quoting here is just philosophy of science 101.
All right. We don't know everything. We're in agreement. There's much more to be discovered.
Again, thanks again for coming on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I did too, Tom. Take care. Bye.
See you.